Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the spring of 1875, travelers passing through the small settlement of Hollow Creek, Kansas, would often stop at a modest establishment known as the Meadowlark Rest. The roadhouse, positioned strategically at a crossroads 15 miles east of Dodge City, offered weary travelers a place to rest, eat, and drink before continuing their journey across the unforgiving Kansas plains. What most of these travelers didn't realize was that for some, this would be their final stop. The roadhouse was run by two sisters, Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood, who had arrived from Pennsylvania 3 years prior. According to county records, they purchased the property with funds they claimed came from an inheritance following their parents' death in a house fire. The sisters were remembered by locals as being cordial but reserved, keeping mostly to themselves except when serving customers. Elizabeth, the elder at 32, handled the business affairs, while Margaret, 29, was known for her cooking, and particularly for a whiskey blend that customers reportedly found uniquely satisfying. The first documented disappearance connected to the Meadowlark Rest occurred in October of 1875, when cattle buyer Thomas Harrington failed to arrive in Wichita for a scheduled meeting. His business associate, James Wilson, reported to the county sheriff that Harrington had mentioned stopping at a roadhouse run by women on his way. This detail alone wouldn't have raised suspicion in the vast territory of Kansas, where travelers frequently went missing due to weather, bandits, or simply changing their plans without notice. What brought attention to the Meadowlark Rest wasn't the disappearance itself, but rather what was discovered during the spring thaw of 1876 by a local trapper named Caleb Morrison. While checking his lines approximately half a mile behind the Blackwood property, Morrison noticed what he initially thought was a discarded leather boot protruding from a shallow depression in the ground. Upon closer inspection, he discovered partial human remains. The investigation that followed would uncover one of the most disturbing series of events in Kansas territorial history, one that local newspapers of the time referred to only in the vaguest of terms, and which official records seem deliberately incomplete. What we know comes primarily from fragments, partial sheriff reports, a journal recovered from the Blackwood property, personal letters, and oral accounts passed down through generations of Hollow Creek residents. This is the story of the Meadowlark Rest and the sisters who served more than just whiskey to their unfortunate guests. In 1875, Hollow Creek was little more than a collection of structures huddled against the vastness of the Kansas prairie. The settlement had sprung up around a natural spring that provided reliable water in the often dry region. Despite its modest size, Hollow Creek served as an important waypoint for travelers, traders, and the occasional stagecoach moving between larger settlements. The main thoroughfare, little more than a widened dirt path, connected Dodge City to the west with Wichita to the east. The Meadowlark Rest stood approximately 1 mile outside of Hollow Creek proper, its weathered wooden structure visible from the road, but set back enough to offer privacy. The building itself was unremarkable, a 2-story main house with an attached stable and what appeared to be a root cellar. A hand-painted sign featuring a crude representation of a meadowlark swung from a post near the road, announcing the establishment to passing travelers. According to town records from 1872, when the Blackwood sisters first arrived, Hollow Creek was experiencing modest growth. The Transcontinental Railroad had been completed 3 years prior, bringing increased traffic and commerce to Kansas. While Hollow Creek wasn't directly on the rail line, it benefited from the general increase in settlers and travelers passing through the territory. Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood purchased the Meadowlark property from a widower named Harold Jenkins, who, according to a brief mention in the Dodge City newspaper, was returning east following an unsuccessful attempt at Western living. The sisters paid in cash and immediately set about converting the former family home into a roadhouse. Descriptions of the sisters come primarily from accounts collected years later. Elizabeth was tall, with dark hair typically worn in a severe bun. She spoke precisely and handled all business matters with what was described as unusual competence for a woman of that time. Margaret, in contrast, was shorter with lighter hair and was generally considered the more approachable of the pair, though both maintained a certain distance from the community. They weren't unfriendly, recalled Sarah Townsend, the general store owner's wife, in an account recorded in 1905. They came into town for supplies regularly, exchanged pleasantries, but they never accepted invitations to socials or church gatherings, always had an excuse ready. After a while, people stopped asking. The sisters' background before arriving in Kansas remains largely a mystery. They claim to be from Philadelphia, though no records confirm this. What is known is that they arrived with enough money to purchase property outright and establish their business, unusual for single women in that era. They spoke of deceased parents and no other family, effectively presenting themselves as alone in the world except for each other. The Meadowlark Rest quickly established itself as a reliable, if somewhat isolated establishment. Travelers could get a hot meal, strong drink, and a clean bed for a reasonable price. The food, particularly Margaret's stews and pies, earned a positive reputation. The sisters also offered a house specialty, a whiskey blend that Margaret claimed was enhanced with secret ingredients. Local residents rarely patronized the roadhouse, as it primarily served travelers passing through. This separation from the community allowed the Blackwood sisters to operate with minimal scrutiny. Sheriff William Parker's records indicate he visited the establishment only twice in its first 2 years of operation, once to introduce himself when they first arrived, and once following a complaint about a drunk traveler causing a disturbance. In retrospect, this isolation would prove crucial to what followed. The sisters established themselves as hard-working, independent women running a legitimate business in a time and place where such endeavors by unmarried women were uncommon but not unheard of. They maintained just enough community presence to avoid suspicion, while their distance from town provided the privacy that their activities would eventually require. According to weather records from 1875, that autumn was particularly cold. The first frost came early in September, and by October, travelers were already contending with occasional snow flurries and biting winds. It was during this seasonal transition that Thomas Harrington, a cattle buyer from St. Louis, made his final journey along the road past the Meadowlark Rest. Harrington's employer, the Western Cattle Trading Company, had sent him west with a substantial sum to purchase cattle from ranchers around Dodge City. According to company records, Harrington was carrying approximately $5,000, a considerable amount for the time. He had successfully concluded his business in Dodge and was expected in Wichita on October 12th to meet with James Wilson, another company representative, before returning to St. Louis. When Harrington failed to appear, Wilson initially assumed a delay due to weather or other common travel complications. After 3 days with no word, Wilson sent a telegraph to Dodge City confirming that Harrington had indeed left as scheduled. Growing concerned, Wilson reported the matter to local authorities and began his own inquiries. A stable hand in Dodge recalled that Harrington had mentioned stopping at a roadhouse run by women about 15 miles east of town. This information eventually led Sheriff Parker to make his third recorded visit to the Meadowlark Rest on October 20th, 1875. According to Parker's report, Elizabeth Blackwood received him with calm composure. She confirmed that a man matching Harrington's description had indeed stopped at the roadhouse on the evening of October 10th. He had a meal, 2 drinks, and continued on his way, she told the sheriff. Said he was hoping to make another 10 miles before dark. Margaret corroborated her sister's account, adding that the man had complimented her cooking and seemed in good spirits. When asked if he had mentioned carrying a large sum of money, both sisters denied any knowledge of such details. "We don't inquire into our guest's business," Elizabeth reportedly stated. Sheriff Parker noted in his report that he found nothing suspicious during his visit. The sisters were cooperative, their story consistent, and the roadhouse itself appeared to be a legitimate business. He concluded that whatever had happened to Harrington had occurred after he left the Meadowlark Rest. The investigation might have ended there, were it not for an unusual notation in Parker's personal journal discovered among his effects after his death in 1889. The entry, dated October 20th, 1875, reads, "Visited the Blackwood place today regarding the missing cattle buyer. Something doesn't sit right with those women." The younger one kept looking to the elder before answering any question, no matter how simple. "Noticed fresh dirt near the root cellar. Could be nothing. We'll ride back next week on other pretense." Whether Sheriff Parker ever made that follow-up visit remains unknown. No official record exists, and his personal journal contains no further mentions of the Blackwood sisters until much later. What is known is that Thomas Harrington was never seen again, and the $5,000 he was carrying was never recovered. In the weeks that followed Harrington's disappearance, 2 more travelers were reported missing in the general vicinity. A land surveyor named Michael Collins and a drummer, traveling salesman, identified only as Peterson in reports. Neither case was strongly connected to the Meadowlark Rest at the time, and frontier life was dangerous enough that such disappearances, while concerning, weren't considered exceptional. As winter settled fully over Kansas, travel diminished significantly. The Meadowlark Rest remained open, though with fewer customers. According to Hollow Creek General Store ledgers, the Blackwood sisters continued to purchase supplies regularly throughout the winter, including unusual quantities of lye, typically used for making soap. When spring arrived in 1876, the thawing ground began to reveal secrets that the frozen Kansas earth had kept hidden through the winter. It was during this thaw that Caleb Morrison, checking his trapping lines, made the discovery that would eventually expose the true nature of the Meadowlark Rest. The winter of 1875-76 had been particularly harsh in Kansas. Snow fell heavily in December, and temperatures remained well below freezing until late March. According to meteorological records preserved in the Dodge City newspaper, it was the coldest winter in memory, with livestock losses estimated at nearly 30% across the territory. For the residents of Hollow Creek, the winter meant isolation and careful rationing of supplies. Travel between settlements virtually ceased, except for the most urgent matters. The Meadowlark Rest remained open, but served only the occasional desperate traveler caught on the road in poor conditions. During this period of relative inactivity, the Blackwood sisters maintained their routine of weekly trips into Hollow Creek for supplies. Martha Henderson, who worked at the general store, later recalled that the sisters' purchasing habits shifted subtly during the winter months. They bought less food, Henderson noted in an account recorded in 1890, but more coal for their stoves. And Elizabeth asked for lye on 3 separate occasions. When I commented that they must be making a great deal of soap, she simply nodded and said something about using the quiet winter to catch up on household tasks. The sisters were also observed making improvements to their property, even in the cold weather. They hired 2 men from town to help reinforce the floor in the main room of the roadhouse. One of these men, Thomas Green, later mentioned that he had noticed an unusual odor in the building, but attributed it to poor ventilation during the winter months. It wasn't until April of 1876 that the temperature rose sufficiently to begin melting the accumulated snow and thawing the frozen ground. As the land awakened from its winter dormancy, Caleb Morrison set out to check his trapping lines, which included territory approximately half a mile behind the Blackwood property. Morrison was a solitary man who supplemented his income by trapping fur-bearing animals during the winter and selling the pelts in spring. His discovery on April 7th is documented in Sheriff Parker's official report. C. Morrison came to office visibly shaken. Reports finding human remains on north edge of Black Creek, approx. Half-mile east of Blackwood Roadhouse. Accompanied Morrison to location, discovered partial human remains, male, appearing to have been disturbed by animals. Most of body still in frozen ground, but one arm and part of torso exposed. Leather boot still on foot. Silver pocket watch found nearby, engraved with initials T.H. Preliminary identification, possibly T. Harrington, missing since October last year. The discovery prompted a more thorough search of the area conducted by Sheriff Parker and a hastily assembled group of men from Hollow Creek. Over the next 3 days, they uncovered 2 more bodies in the same vicinity, both male, both partially decomposed. One was tentatively identified as Michael Collins, based on surveying equipment found nearby. The other remained unidentified but was presumed to be the missing salesman Peterson. The cause of death wasn't immediately apparent for any of the victims due to the condition of the remains. However, Sheriff Parker noted in his report that all 3 men were found without any money or valuables beyond Collins's surveying equipment and Harrington's pocket watch, which had likely been overlooked due to being partially buried. The proximity of the bodies to the Meadowlark Rest raised immediate suspicion, but at this point there was no direct evidence linking the Blackwood sisters to the deaths. Sheriff Parker decided to approach the investigation cautiously. Rather than confronting the sisters directly, he increased his surveillance of their property while sending telegraphs to authorities in Philadelphia seeking information about their background. He also interviewed recent customers of the Roadhouse, trying to establish a pattern. One such interview proved particularly valuable. A cattle driver named Jeremiah Wells had stayed at the Meadowlark Rest in late March. He reported that during his stay, he had mentioned to Margaret that he was only passing through with the cattle and would be paid upon delivery in Wichita. The demeanor of both sisters changed noticeably after that, Wells stated. They became less attentive, almost dismissive. The younger one, who had been friendly at first, barely spoke to me after. Armed with mounting circumstantial evidence, Sheriff Parker planned a formal visit to the Meadowlark Rest to question the sisters again. However, when he arrived on April 12, 1876, he found the property deserted. The sisters had departed sometime during the previous night, taking only personal essentials and leaving behind most of the Roadhouse furnishings. A search of the abandoned property revealed disturbing evidence that would soon confirm the community's worst fears about what had been happening at the Meadowlark Rest. The initial search of the abandoned Roadhouse revealed little beyond the signs of a hasty departure. Clothing remained in drawers, food in the pantry, and business ledgers open on Elizabeth's desk. It wasn't until Sheriff Parker and his deputies examined the root cellar that they began to understand the true nature of the establishment. The cellar, accessible via a slanted door behind the main building, had been expanded beyond what would be typical for food storage. Additional rooms had been roughly excavated, their earthen walls supported by timber beams. The first room contained preserved food, as expected, but a second, hidden behind a false wall of stacked barrels, held items of a more disturbing nature. Sheriff Parker's official report, portion of which were later sealed by court order, described finding personal effects belonging to multiple individuals, including wallets, pocket watches, wedding rings, and other jewelry. A locked chest contained over $6,000 in cash, including banknotes that were later confirmed to match the serial numbers of those carried by Thomas Harrington. Most damning was the discovery of a leather-bound journal belonging to Margaret Blackwood. The journal, which covered the period from the sisters' arrival in Kansas through March 1876, provided a chilling account of the operations at the Meadowlark Rest. While the original journal was eventually transferred to the Kansas State Archives and sealed from public view until 1950, transcribed excerpts were included in court documents and subsequent historical accounts. These excerpts reveal a calculated operation designed to target travelers carrying substantial sums of money. From the journal, October 8, 1875. E. has developed a system for identifying promising guests. She observes their clothing, quality of possessions, whether they pay with paper money or coins. Those who mention business in Dodge or Wichita are often carrying larger sums. Tonight, a cattle buyer arrived. His boots are worn, but his watch is gold. E says he's perfect. October 10, 1875. The cattle buyer Harrington took the special blend. 3 glasses as usual. He began to show the effects during supper, mentioning his success in purchasing a large herd. The amount he carries exceeds $5,000. After the 4th glass, he could barely maintain consciousness. E helped him to room 3. The procedure was completed before midnight. The disposal will wait until tomorrow due to the late hour. The special blend referred to in multiple entries was Margaret's whiskey mixture, which forensic analysis in 1952 determined likely contained significant amounts of laudanum, a tincture of opium readily available at the time for medicinal purposes. When consumed with alcohol, it produced a powerful sedative effect that would render victims unconscious and, in sufficient quantities, could be fatal. The journal detailed a consistent methodology: identify travelers likely carrying money, serve them the drugged whiskey, wait for them to become incapacitated, then rob and kill them. The bodies were initially buried in the root cellar, but were later moved to the more distant location where Morrison eventually discovered them, presumably due to space limitations and concerns about odors. Further investigation of the property revealed bloodstains on the floorboards of Room 3, which had been covered by a large rug. Underneath the floorboards, investigators discovered additional evidence, including personal papers belonging to several unidentified individuals who may represent victims beyond the 3 confirmed cases. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that the sisters had apparently been serving some form of human remains to unsuspecting guests. From the Journal, December 12, 1875. Supplies running low with the snow. E suggested we utilize all available resources. The stew was served to the mail carrier today. He complimented its richness and took a second helping. E finds this amusing. I am less certain, though the practicality cannot be denied. This revelation was deemed too shocking for public disclosure, and references to it were heavily redacted from official reports. However, the information gradually became part of local oral history, passed down through generations as a gruesome detail of the case. With the Blackwood sisters gone and evidence of their crimes discovered, the authorities issued notices to law enforcement across the territory and neighboring states. The description included their physical appearances and noted that they might be traveling together or separately, possibly using different names. The abandoned roadhouse quickly became a source of macabre fascination. Despite Sheriff Parker's attempts to limit access, curious locals and travelers alike visited the site to glimpse the scene of such disturbing events. Within weeks, unknown persons set fire to the building, burning it to the ground. Whether this was an act of vigilante justice or an attempt to purify the location remains unclear. As for the victims, the 3 discovered bodies were given proper burials in the Hollow Creek Cemetery. A simple marker was erected, reading only, "Here lie 3 travelers, victims of cruel deception. May they find the peace in death that was denied them in their final moments of life." The search for the Blackwood sisters continued throughout 1876, but initial efforts proved fruitless. The trail went cold at Fort Smith, Arkansas, where a stagecoach driver recalled transporting 2 women, matching their description in late April. After that, it seemed as though Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood had simply vanished. It wasn't until 1878, nearly 2 years after their flight from Kansas, that a potential lead emerged from an unexpected source. A letter arrived for Sheriff Parker from a Dr. Edwin Holcomb of the Western Missouri Asylum for the Insane, located near St. Joseph. The doctor had read about the Blackwood case in a law enforcement circular and believed one of his patients might be Margaret Blackwood. According to Dr. Holcomb's letter, a woman calling herself Mary Black had been committed to the asylum in June of 1876 by a person claiming to be her sister. The sister had never returned to visit, and Mary had been exhibiting increasingly disturbed behavior, including making statements about travelers who never continued their journeys and special ingredients in her cooking. Sheriff Parker traveled to Missouri to interview the patient. His notes from this meeting, preserved in the county archives, indicate his certainty that Mary Black was indeed Margaret Blackwood. The woman, however, was in no condition to stand trial. She alternated between periods of catatonia and violent outbursts, often muttering about Elizabeth's disappointment and how she should have been stronger. Dr. Holcomb's medical assessment suggested that Margaret had suffered some form of mental break. Whether this was due to guilt over their crimes, fear of capture, or some pre-existing condition exacerbated by their actions remains a matter of speculation. What seems clear is that Elizabeth had abandoned her sister at the asylum and continued her flight alone. Margaret Blackwood, under the name Mary Black, remained at the Western Missouri Asylum until her death in 1881 from tuberculosis. She never recovered sufficient lucidity to provide useful information about her sister's whereabouts or to stand trial for the murders at the Meadowlark Rest. Elizabeth Blackwood's fate remained unknown for much longer. Despite continued searches and periodic reports of sightings, no confirmed trace of her was found for nearly a decade. Then, in 1887, a banker in San Francisco reported suspicious activity involving a woman who matched Elizabeth's description, but was using the name Eleanor Bates. According to bank records, Eleanor Bates had established accounts in 3 different San Francisco banks and was involved in financing a small hotel near the waterfront. Investigations revealed that several male guests at this hotel had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, though no bodies had been discovered. Before authorities could apprehend her, Eleanor disappeared once again, withdrawing her funds and abandoning the hotel. The pattern suggested that Elizabeth had continued her criminal activities but had adapted her methods to the urban environment, becoming more careful about disposal of evidence. The final confirmed chapter in the story of Elizabeth Blackwood came in 1892, 16 years after the discovery of the bodies near the Meadowlark Rest. A fire at a boarding house in Denver, Colorado, led to the identification of the proprietress, a woman in her late 40s who had been living under the name Elizabeth Black, as the long-sought fugitive. The identification came through an unusual source. A former resident of Hollow Creek who had relocated to Denver recognized her despite the passage of years. By the time authorities acted on this information, Elizabeth had fled once again, but she left behind documents that provided insight into her movements over the years. Letters found in a locked box in her room indicated that she had operated similar establishments in at least 5 different cities across the western states. All was targeting isolated male travelers who appeared to have means. She had amassed considerable wealth through these activities, with bank books showing accounts under various names in multiple states. One letter, apparently written to her deceased sister, but never sent, contained a partial confession. "I continue our work, though without your special talents, I've had to modify the approach. The cities offer both greater opportunities and greater risks. Sometimes I think of returning to the simplicity of our Kansas arrangement, but those days are gone. I've learned that movement is essential. 3 years in any location is the maximum before questions begin. I've become adept at transformation in name, appearance, and manner. No one sees Elizabeth Blackwood anymore. I'm not entirely sure she still exists, even to me." The letter suggested a fractured mental state, similar to her sister's, though manifesting in different ways. Elizabeth appeared to have developed distinct personas for her different identities, perhaps as a psychological mechanism to distance herself from her crimes. The final confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Blackwood occurred in November of 1892, when a woman matching her description boarded a steamship bound for South America. Passenger records indicate that a woman traveling under the name Elizabeth Barrett departed Denver for New Orleans and subsequently booked passage to Buenos Aires. After that, the trail goes cold permanently. Investigations continued sporadically for several years, but no further evidence of Elizabeth's whereabouts ever surfaced. In 1901, the case was officially closed, with Elizabeth Blackwood presumed either dead or permanently beyond the reach of American authorities. The legacy of the Blackwood sisters and the Meadowlark Rest lingered long in the collective memory of Kansas. The site where the roadhouse once stood remained vacant, with local residents refusing to build there despite the land's prime location near the crossroads. Eventually, the county designated the area as public land, establishing a small memorial grove in 1925, 50 years after the first known murder. The story of the Meadowlark Rest became part of local folklore, a cautionary tale about the dangers that could lurk behind seemingly respectable facades. Parents warned children not to accept food or drink from strangers, invoking the Blackwood sisters' special recipe as a fearsome consequence. In historical context, the case of the Blackwood sisters stands out for several reasons. Female serial killers were exceedingly rare in the documented criminal history of the American frontier. The sisters' methodical approach, their selection of victims, and their business model all demonstrated a level of calculation unusual for crimes of the period which more typically involved passion, impulse, or immediate gain. The case also highlighted the particular vulnerabilities of the frontier environment. Travelers were dependent on the hospitality of strangers in isolated locations. The transient nature of frontier population made disappearances less immediately noticeable, and the vast empty spaces provided ample opportunity for the disposal of evidence. In 1952, historian Amelia Thornton gained access to the sealed records related to the case as part of research for a comprehensive history of frontier-era crimes. Her detailed analysis, published in the Journal of Western Criminal History, provided the most complete account of the Blackwood case assembled to date. Thornton's research suggested that the confirmed victims, Harrington, Collins, and Peterson, likely represented only a fraction of those who met their end at the Meadowlark Rest. Based on financial records and journal entries, she estimated that as many as 12 to 15 travelers may have been murdered during the sisters' 3-year operation in Kansas. Moreover, if Elizabeth continued her activities in the various locations she inhabited after leaving Kansas, the total number of victims could be significantly higher. Without concrete evidence, however, these additional murders remain speculative. Thornton also addressed the psychological aspects of the case, consulting with medical professionals of her era to analyze the sisters' behavior patterns. The prevailing theory that emerged suggested that Elizabeth was the dominant partner and likely the initiator of the criminal enterprise, with Margaret as a more reluctant but ultimately complicit participant. Margaret's subsequent mental breakdown and Elizabeth's apparent development of multiple distinct personas both indicated severe psychological disturbances. Whether these conditions preceded their crimes or developed as a result of their actions remains an open question. The Blackwood case has been largely forgotten in broader historical accounts of the American frontier. The sensational nature of their crimes, particularly the alleged cannibalism aspect, made the story unsuitable for many mainstream histories. Additionally, the limited documentation, much of it sealed or redacted, made comprehensive research challenging. In more recent years, the case has occasionally resurfaced in specialized studies of frontier-era crime or examinations of female criminals in American history. A 1965 dissertation by criminologist Howard Jenkins at the University of Kansas, titled Gender and Methodology in Frontier Murder Cases, devoted a chapter to the Blackwood sisters, noting their unusual position as female perpetrators who targeted male victims, a reversal of the more common pattern. The location where the Meadowlark Rest once stood is now marked only by a small plaque installed in 1975, on the centennial of the first known murder. The inscription reads simply, "On this site stood the Meadowlark Rest, 1872-1876. The tragic events that occurred here remind us that danger can wear many faces. May those who perished find eternal peace. Hollow Creek itself no longer exists as a distinct settlement. As railroads expanded and transportation patterns shifted, the once promising community gradually declined. By the early 1900s, it had been absorbed into the expanding boundaries of a neighboring town. Today, few residents of the area are aware of the dark chapter in their local history. The story of the Blackwood Sisters remains primarily in academic archives and local folklore. It serves as a reminder of a time when the vast openness of the American frontier offered opportunities not only for honest advancement, but also for those with darker intentions. In October 1968, during renovations to the county courthouse in Dodge City, workers discovered a previously unknown storage space beneath the floorboards of what had once been Sheriff Parker's office. Among the items found was a sealed metal box containing additional documents related to the Blackwood case that had never been filed with the official records. These documents included several pages, apparently torn from Margaret's journal, that had not been included in the court transcripts. The content of these pages was disturbing enough that county officials initially considered destroying them, rather than adding them to the historical record. One historian who was granted limited access to these documents in the early 1960s for academic research described them as containing detailed accounts of Margaret's culinary practices that challenge our understanding of human depravity. The full contents have never been made public, and this historian refused to discuss them in detail, stating only that some historical truths are perhaps better left unexplored. Another document found in the metal box was a letter addressed to Sheriff Parker, dated 1895 and postmarked from Argentina. However, the historical value was ultimately deemed to outweigh the disturbing nature of the content, and the pages were transferred to the state archives with the stipulation that they remain sealed for an additional 50 years. The letter was signed simply E and contained only a brief message. You were right to suspect the root cellar, but you didn't dig deep enough. Some secrets will remain buried forever. I sometimes miss the Kansas sky. The letter was subjected to handwriting analysis in the 1960s and determined to likely be authentic. If so, it confirms that Elizabeth Blackwood did indeed escape to South America and was still alive nearly 20 years after the crimes at the Meadowlark Rest. Perhaps the most enigmatic item in the discovered box was a small, leather-bound recipe book. Most pages contained standard frontier-era recipes, but several pages featured entries in a coded script that has never been fully deciphered. The few sections that experts have managed to translate appear to describe methods of preparing and preserving meat using techniques not typical of the period. These additional documents add layers of complexity to an already disturbing case, suggesting that the full extent of the Blackwood sisters' activities may have been even more horrific than the official record indicates. Today, the story of the Meadowlark Rest occasionally resurfaces when historians or true crime enthusiasts delve into the darker aspects of frontier history. The case has inspired fictional adaptations, including a 1955 pulp novel titled Sisters of the Bloody Hearth and a 1967 low-budget film called Roadhouse of Horror, both of which took significant liberties with the historical facts. The psychological aspects of the case continue to interest modern criminologists. A 2003 paper in the Journal of Historical Criminology titled Gendered Partnerships in Frontier-Era Serial Killings used the Blackwood case as one of its primary examples, examining the dynamics between the sisters and comparing their methodology to other documented cases of female serial killers throughout American history. What remains most disturbing about the case is not just the nature of the crimes themselves, but the calculated efficiency with which they were carried out. The Blackwood sisters created a business model that made murder profitable, sustainable, and, for nearly 3 years, undetected. They exploited the vulnerabilities inherent in frontier travel and the trust that weary travelers placed in roadside establishments. One aspect of the Blackwood case that remains particularly intriguing is the sisters' origin story. While they claimed to be from Philadelphia and to have received an inheritance from deceased parents, no records confirming these claims have ever been found. Thornton's research in the 1950s included a thorough examination of Philadelphia records from the period, turning up no trace of a Blackwood family matching the sisters' description. This absence of verifiable history prior to their arrival in Kansas has led some researchers to speculate that Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood themselves may have been fabricated identities. If so, the question becomes, who were they before Hollow Creek, and what circumstances led them to develop their lethal enterprise? A tantalizing clue emerged in 1958 when a researcher examining newspaper archives from eastern Pennsylvania discovered a brief article from 1871 describing the disappearance of two sisters, Agnes and Charlotte Weber, from a small town near Pittsburgh, following the suspicious deaths of both their husbands within months of each other. The physical descriptions of the Weber sisters broadly matched those of Elizabeth and Margaret Blackwood, and the timing of their disappearance coincided with the Blackwoods' appearance in Kansas. While this connection remains speculative, it suggests a possible narrative. Two women who murdered their husbands for financial gain fled east to west to escape suspicion, and eventually refined their methodology into the efficient operation that would claim at least a dozen more lives in Kansas. Another enduring mystery surrounds the exact method the sisters used to dispatch their victims. Margaret's journal references the procedure, but never describes it explicitly. The condition of the recovered bodies made determining cause of death impossible. Sheriff Parker's report notes that no gunshot wounds were apparent on the visible portions of the remains, and no significant quantities of blood were found in room 3, despite evidence that it was the site of the killings. This has led to speculation that the sisters used some form of suffocation or strangulation, methods that would leave minimal evidence and allow them to maintain control over physically stronger victims who were already incapacitated by the drugged whiskey. Dr. P. Holcomb's records from the Western Missouri Asylum contain a cryptic note regarding Margaret Blackwood's behavior during periods of agitation. Patient repeatedly makes grasping motions with hands while murmuring, "quickly," before he wakes. When asked about this behavior, she becomes immediately calm and denies any knowledge of it. The question of how many total victims the Blackwood sisters claimed over the course of their criminal careers continues to fascinate and disturb researchers. The confirmed victims in Kansas number only 3, but evidence suggests the actual count was much higher. Entries in Margaret's journal often referred to guests by room number rather than name, making it difficult to establish a precise count. However, a coded section in the back pages of the journal, partially deciphered in the 1960s, appears to be a financial ledger tracking proceeds from their crimes. If the interpretation is correct, the entries suggest approximately 17 victims during the Kansas period alone. Elizabeth's activities after leaving Kansas are even more difficult to quantify. The Denver documents indicate she operated in at least 5 different locations, each for periods of 2 to 3 years. If she maintained a similar rate of activity, the total victim count could potentially reach into the dozens. In San Francisco, where Elizabeth operated a waterfront hotel under the name Eleanor Bates, police records from 1887-1889 note 9 reported cases of male travelers who were last seen entering her establishment. None of these men were ever found, and the cases were largely forgotten after Eleanor disappeared. In Denver, where she was nearly captured, at least 4 similar disappearances were connected to her boarding house during her tenure there. Again, no bodies were ever recovered, suggesting that Elizabeth had refined her disposal methods since the relatively careless burials in Kansas. The Blackwood case also raises questions about how the sisters were able to overpower their victims, even when the men were drugged. Elizabeth was described as tall, but not particularly strong in physical appearance. Contemporary accounts suggest that she may have employed additional methods beyond the drugged whiskey to ensure control over her victims. a traveler who stayed at the Meadowlark Rest in early 1876 and survived the experience, later recalled that Elizabeth had shown unusual interest in his firearms. She asked to examine my revolver, claiming she'd never seen one up close, the man stated. She handled it with surprising familiarity for someone professing ignorance. This suggests the possibility that the sisters may have used their victims' own weapons to control or threaten them during the robbery phase of their crimes. There are also indications that the sisters may have occasionally employed temporary male accomplices. Margaret's journal contains several references to a man identified only as J, who appears to have assisted with the disposal of bodies during the winter months when the ground was frozen. The entry for January 15, 1876 reads, J helped move the recent guest to storage. He asks too many questions. He says he won't be a concern much longer. No subsequent entries mention J, leading some researchers to speculate that he may have become a victim himself once his usefulness ended. This theory is supported by the discovery during the 1968 courthouse renovations of a previously unknown missing person report for a drifter named James Hallett, who had been seen working at the Meadowlark Rest in early 1876 and disappeared shortly thereafter. The question of how the sisters selected their victims has been the subject of considerable analysis. While financial gain was clearly the primary motive, the journal entries suggest that Elizabeth employed specific criteria beyond simply identifying travelers with money. She appears to have preferred victims who were traveling alone and had no clear connections to the local community. She also avoided targeting travelers who had mentioned to other guests that they planned to stop at the Meadowlark Rest, presumably to reduce the likelihood of immediate inquiries. An entry from November 1875 provides insight into her methodology. Two men arrived together this evening, well-dressed, clearly carrying funds. E says we wait. Groups are complications. Better to focus on the solitary ones, fewer questions afterward. This calculated approach explains why the sisters were able to operate undetected for so long. By selecting victims who were already disconnected from social networks, they minimized the chances of raising immediate alarms. In the context of frontier travel, where journeys could take weeks or months and communication was limited, the disappearance of a lone traveler might not be noted for a considerable time. The sisters also appeared to target men who exhibited certain personality traits. Margaret's journal notes that Elizabeth preferred guests who speak of themselves freely and enjoy attention from women. Such men would be more likely to reveal information about their finances and might be less guarded with the seemingly harmless sisters. A particularly disturbing aspect of the case that emerged from the unsealed documents was the evolution of Margaret's role in the murders. Early journal entries suggest she was initially reluctant, possibly coerced by her more dominant sister. An entry from August 1873 during their first year of operation reads, "Another tonight. E insists it's necessary. I cannot sleep afterward. The sounds stay with me." By 1875, however, her entries reflect a disturbing shift toward active participation and even innovation. Discovered that adding elderberry to the blend masks the bitter taste. They drink more readily now, which hastens the effect. E praised my initiative. This psychological transformation from reluctant accomplice to active participant has been the subject of several academic studies in criminal psychology. Dr. Eleanor Westfield's 1984 paper, The Blackwood Sisters, a case study in criminal codependency, suggests that Margaret's increasing involvement may have been a psychological adaptation, a way to reduce her cognitive dissonance by embracing rather than resisting the criminal lifestyle. The economic aspects of the Blackwood operation also deserve consideration. Based on the financial records recovered from the roadhouse and Elizabeth's subsequent locations, the sisters amassed considerable wealth through their crimes. The $6,000 found in the root cellar represented only their current holdings. Bank records discovered among Elizabeth's papers in Denver indicated deposits in multiple banks across several states totaling over $24,000. a substantial fortune for the time. This financial success may explain Elizabeth's persistence in continuing the criminal enterprise even after the narrow escape from Kansas. Having established a profitable methodology, she appears to have been unwilling to abandon it, despite the risks. Instead, she adapted and refined her approach to minimize those risks. The most extensive contemporary account of the Blackwood case comes from Jacob Harmon, a reporter for the Dodge City Times who followed the investigation in 1876. Harmon's articles, while somewhat sensationalized, provide valuable details about the community's reaction to the discoveries. The revelation of what transpired at the Meadowlark Rest has cast a pall over Hollow Creek, Harmon wrote in April 1876. Citizens who exchanged pleasantries with the Blackwood women now examine their own memories, searching for signs they might have missed. The thought that such depravity existed in their midst, undetected, has shaken the community's confidence. Harmon's reporting also captured the psychological impact on those who had dined at the roadhouse. Men who partook of meals at the establishment now speak of feeling ill at the mere thought of what might have been served to them. Several have consulted physicians, convinced they suffer lingering effects from unknown substances consumed there. The investigation's impact extended beyond Hollow Creek. Throughout Kansas and neighboring territories, travelers became more wary of isolated establishments, particularly those run by women, an unfortunate consequence that affected legitimate female business owners. Several roadhouses operated by women reported significant declines in business following news of the Blackwood case. The legal aftermath of the case presented unique challenges. With the sisters gone, and only one of them eventually located in a condition unfit for trial, the formal judicial process remained incomplete. This lack of resolution contributed to the case's enduring mystique and encouraged speculation and embellishment in subsequent retellings. Sheriff Parker continued to pursue the case until his death in 1889, maintaining correspondence with law enforcement agencies across the country and accumulating what became known as the Blackwood File, a collection of reports, letters, and notes that eventually filled 2 large boxes. This dedication suggests the profound impact the case had on him personally and professionally. In a private letter to his brother in 1886, Parker wrote, "Of all the grim business I've encountered in my years as sheriff, none disturbs my sleep like the Blackwood matter, not merely for the depravity of the acts themselves, but for how long they continued under my very nose. I rode past that place a dozen times, tipped my hat to those women, never suspecting. That failure of perception haunts me still." The Blackwood case eventually transcended its status as a mere criminal matter to become something approaching a cultural touchstone in the region, a story that encapsulated fears about the dangers lurking within the seemingly civilized veneer of frontier society. It served as a reminder that the Western expansion, for all its romantic portrayal in later literature and film, had a darker undercurrent of vulnerability and isolation. The case gained renewed attention in 1938 when popular radio program Frontiers of Justice featured a dramatized version of the story. While taking considerable liberties with the facts, the broadcast reached a national audience and established the Blackwood sisters in the pantheon of American criminal lore. The program's tagline, "Beware the hospitality of strangers on the lonely frontier," captured the cautionary essence of the story. In 1955, historian Richard Slotkin included the Blackwood case in his comprehensive study, Violence and Vengeance, Criminal Justice on the American Frontier. Slotkin noted that the case represented a significant departure from typical frontier crime patterns, which generally involved immediate, often impulsive violence, rather than the calculated, sustained predation exhibited by the Blackwood sisters. What makes the Blackwood case particularly significant, Slotkin wrote, is its inversion of expected gender roles in frontier violence. Here, women were the predators and men the prey, upending the conventional narrative of frontier vulnerability. This gender dynamic has made the case particularly interesting to feminist historians and criminologists in recent decades. Dr. Meredith Coleman's 1998 analysis, Deadly Domesticity, The Blackwood Sisters and Subversion of Frontier Gender Norms, argues that the sisters' methodology represented a dark appropriation of traditionally female domains, hospitality, food preparation, and domestic comfort, transforming them into weapons. By weaponizing the very aspects of femininity that were supposed to make women non-threatening, Coleman writes, the Blackwoods exploited and ultimately undermined the gender assumptions that structured frontier society. The physical evidence from the case has been largely lost to time. The original journal was damaged in a basement flood at the Kansas State Archives in 1962, though fortunately, after the most significant portions had been transcribed. The site of the Meadowlark Rest has never been systematically excavated using modern archaeological techniques, leaving open the possibility that additional evidence remains buried there. In 2005, a team from the University of Kansas proposed a forensic archaeological survey of the site, but permission was denied by the county commission, which expressed concerns about disturbing what had effectively become a memorial site. Some local residents also opposed the project, preferring to let the tragic history rest undisturbed. One of the few tangible artifacts from the case that remains accessible to the public is Thomas Harrington's silver pocket watch, which is displayed at the Kansas State Historical Museum in Topeka. The watch, stopped at 1037, bears the simple inscription, "To Thomas, with pride, Father." This personal item serves as a poignant reminder of the individual lives cut short by the Blackwood sisters' crimes. The case has inspired numerous fictional works beyond the previously mentioned novel and film. A 1972 episode of the television series The Westerner, titled The Sisters, was loosely based on the Blackwood story, though it significantly sanitized the more disturbing elements. More recently, award-winning author Cormac McCarthy acknowledged the Blackwood case as partial inspiration for aspects of his 1985 novel Blood Meridian, particularly its exploration of the business-like approach to violence on the frontier. In 2012, playwright Rebecca Gilman produced Whiskey and Laudanum, an off-Broadway play that reimagined the Blackwood sisters' story with a focus on the psychological relationship between the sisters. While taking artistic liberties with historical facts, the production was praised for its exploration of how ordinary people can evolve into predators under specific psychological and environmental conditions. The ongoing fascination with the Blackwood case speaks to its uniqueness in the annals of frontier crime. Most notorious criminals of the era, Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, operated in the public eye, their crimes bold and visible, their personas carefully cultivated. The Blackwood sisters, in contrast, thrived through invisibility and mundanity, their true nature concealed behind a facade of respectable female enterprise. This subtlety, this subversion of expectations, makes their story particularly unsettling. It suggests that the most dangerous predators might not be the obvious outlaws, but rather those who successfully mimic normalcy while concealing monstrous intentions. In this respect, the Blackwood sisters presaged a more modern understanding of predatory criminality, one that recognizes how effective camouflage can be the most dangerous weapon in a killer's arsenal. The question of what drove the sisters to their crimes remains perhaps the most compelling aspect of the case. Were they simply opportunistic killers who found an effective methodology, or did deeper psychological factors motivate their actions? Elizabeth's background before Kansas remains largely unknown, but Margaret's asylum records provide some potential insights. Dr. Holcomb noted that during periods of relative lucidity, Margaret often spoke of a childhood characterized by extreme poverty and an abusive father. Whether these accounts were factual or delusions remains uncertain, but they suggest a narrative of early trauma that might have contributed to her later actions. One particularly notable entry in Dr. Holcomb's records describes Margaret's reaction when she was accidentally given a meal containing meat. The patient became extremely agitated, pushing the plate away violently and repeating, "I know what's in it, I know what's in it," for several minutes before attendants could calm her. This reaction suggests that even in her mentally compromised state, Margaret retained awareness of and distress about the sisters' alleged cannibalistic practices. This consciousness of her crimes, persisting through her mental deterioration, hints at the profound psychological impact of her actions. For Elizabeth, whose mental state appears to have remained more functional, different questions arise. Her ability to repeatedly establish new identities and businesses after Kansas demonstrates remarkable adaptability and self-control. The letter found in Denver, with its reference to becoming adept at transformation, suggests she had developed a compartmentalized psychology that allowed her to move between identities without being overwhelmed by the weight of her crimes. Criminologist Dr. Robert Hare, reviewing the Blackwood case records in 1992, suggested that Elizabeth displayed many characteristics consistent with what modern psychology would classify as psychopathic personality traits: superficial charm, manipulative behavior, lack of empathy, and failure to accept responsibility for actions. What makes the Elizabeth Blackwood case particularly interesting from a psychological perspective, Hare wrote, is her apparent ability to maintain functional relationships with her sister, with community members, with customers, while simultaneously planning and executing predatory actions against selected victims. This capacity for selective predation represents a sophisticated form of psychopathy rarely documented in female subjects of that era. The relationship between the sisters continues to fascinate researchers. Elizabeth's abandonment of Margaret at the asylum in Missouri represents a significant turning point. Whether this separation was strategic, allowing Elizabeth to travel more easily alone, or represented a more complex emotional break, remains uncertain. Margaret's asylum statement suggests she felt betrayed by her sister's abandonment. During one interview with Sheriff Parker, she reportedly asked repeatedly, "Did she send anything for me, any message?" When told no, she lapsed into catatonia for several hours. This dynamic, Elizabeth as the dominant partner who ultimately abandoned her more vulnerable sister, adds a layer of tragedy to an already disturbing case. It suggests that even the bond between the sisters, seemingly the one relationship they maintained, was ultimately sacrificed to Elizabeth's survival instinct. The Blackwood case also serves as a lens through which to view broader aspects of frontier society. The sisters' ability to operate undetected for years highlights the limited investigative capabilities of law enforcement in that era and environment. Sheriff Parker, though dedicated and competent by contemporary standards, lacked the forensic tools, communication networks, and investigative methodologies that would become standard in later decades. The case underscores the vulnerability created by the transient nature of frontier population. In a society where people frequently arrived without verifiable backgrounds and departed without explanation, the disappearance of travelers created minimal disturbance in the social fabric. This fluidity provided ideal conditions for predators like the Blackwood sisters. The discovery of Elizabeth's continued activities in urban settings after leaving Kansas demonstrates how the criminal methodology she developed on the frontier could be adapted to more densely populated environments. This adaptability suggests that the skills developed for frontier predation, identification of vulnerable targets, establishment of false trust, disposal of evidence, remained effective even as the American frontier began to close. In his definitive 1998 book, The Blackwood Sisters, America's Forgotten Female Predators, historian Thomas Mitchell argues that the sisters represent an important but overlooked counterpoint to the male-dominated narrative of frontier violence. The Blackwood case challenges our gendered assumptions about violence in the American West, Mitchell writes. By operating within traditionally female spaces, the domestic, the culinary, the hospitable, the sisters subverted expectations in ways that allowed their predation to continue undetected. Their crimes force us to reconsider not only who could be dangerous on the frontier, but how danger itself could be concealed within the most seemingly benign settings. This reconsideration extends to how we understand the broader landscape of frontier crime. While traditional narratives focus on bank robberies, shootouts, and stagecoach holdups, public, visible crimes typically committed by men, the Blackwood case reminds us that a parallel criminal universe existed, one that operated in quieter, more private spaces, often occupied by women. The site of the Meadowlark Rest today bears little evidence of its dark history. Located on what is now private farmland, the exact location is marked only by the small county memorial installed in 1975. Occasional visitors leave coins or small tokens on the memorial stone, though whether this represents awareness of the historical significance or simply a general gesture of respect for the dead is unclear. Local residents have reported unusual experiences in the vicinity of the former roadhouse site. These accounts, while impossible to verify, have contributed to the location's folklore. Some claim to hear faint piano music on quiet nights, though no piano was documented among the roadhouse furnishings. Others describe sudden, inexplicable feelings of dread when passing the site, particularly around dusk. While such reports can be dismissed as the natural human tendency to associate supernatural phenomena with sites of historical tragedy, they speak to the way the Blackwood case continues to resonate in the collective consciousness of the region. The most significant remaining mystery of the case involves the full extent of Elizabeth Blackwood's life and crimes after leaving Kansas. The fragmentary evidence from San Francisco and Denver suggests she continued her criminal activities in some form, but the details remain elusive. The letter postmarked from Argentina in 1895 provides the last confirmed trace of her existence. If she was indeed living in South America at that time, she would have been in her early 50s, potentially young enough to continue her criminal career for many more years. Some researchers have attempted to identify potential Blackwood victims or enterprises in Argentina, focusing particularly on Buenos Aires, which was experiencing significant growth and an influx of foreign visitors in the late 19th century. To date, no conclusive connections have been established, though several unsolved disappearances of foreign businessmen in Buenos Aires between 1893 and 1901 have been noted as potentially relevant. The Blackwood case represents more than just a series of frontier murders. It serves as a dark mirror reflecting aspects of American society during a period of transition and expansion. The sisters exploited the opportunities created by westward movement, the limitations of communication and law enforcement, and the vulnerability of travelers in unfamiliar territory. Their story reminds us that the American frontier, often romanticized in popular culture, had a shadow side, places where the normal rules and protections of civilization were attenuated, creating spaces for predatory individuals to operate with minimal constraint. Perhaps most disturbingly, the Blackwood case demonstrates how effectively normality can be counterfeited. The sisters maintained a facade of respectability, running a legitimate business, participating minimally but appropriately in community life, presenting themselves as hard-working, independent women. This outward appearance of conformity provided the perfect cover for their true activities. In this respect, the case speaks to timeless human anxieties about deception and betrayal. The traveler who stops at the Meadowlark Rest, accepting food and drink from seemingly hospitable hosts, only to be drugged, robbed, and murdered, represents a primal fear that those who appear to offer safety and comfort may in fact harbor deadly intentions. As we close this account of the Meadowlark Rest and its proprietresses, we are left with an incomplete narrative. The full truth of the Blackwood sisters, their origins, their motivations, the complete tally of their victims, Elizabeth's final fate, remains partially obscured by time, deliberate concealment, and the limitations of historical record. What remains clear is the impact of their crimes, both on their immediate victims and on the broader community. The discovery of the bodies near the Meadowlark Rest in the spring of 1876 shattered the sense of security in Hollow Creek and rippled outward, changing how travelers approached roadside establishments throughout the region. For modern observers, the case serves as a reminder that predatory behavior has existed in many forms throughout history, adapting to specific social and environmental conditions. The Blackwood sisters found their opportunity in the particular vulnerabilities of frontier travel, but their methodology, identifying vulnerable targets, gaining trust, exploiting isolation, represents patterns that persist in different forms to the present day. In the end, the story of the Meadowlark Rest is not merely a historical curiosity, but a case study in human predation, how it arises, how it operates, and how it can remain hidden in plain sight. The sisters, who poured more than just whiskey for their guests, remind us that danger can wear a welcoming smile, and that hospitality, one of humanity's oldest virtues, can in the darkest circumstances become a weapon. Today, as travelers speed past the former site of the Meadowlark Rest on modern highways, few are aware of the tragedies that unfolded there. The land itself holds no visible scars from its dark past. But the story persists in archives, in academic studies, in local lore, and now in this account, a shadow narrative of the American frontier, a reminder of the darkness that sometimes lurked beneath the expansive promise of the West. As a final postscript to this account, it is worth noting that in 1962, an elderly woman in Buenos Aires passed away, leaving a substantial estate to various charities. Among her possessions was a small, weathered sign bearing the image of a meadowlark. Whether this represented a macabre souvenir, a coincidence, or a final clue to the ultimate fate of Elizabeth Blackwood remains, like so much of this case, tantalizingly unresolved.